So good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on which time zone you're at. I'm actually here in Amsterdam, so it's almost evening for me. Welcome to today's webinar. We're still waiting for our official moderator, Alistair Pugin, to join. He probably has some technical difficulties joining us today, but that doesn't keep us from starting already. So welcome. Today's webinar from Xilio and Protiviti. We will talk about how is Project Cortex impacting the way we work and manage our documents. So today, Antonio will give a presentation, and then Sjoerd of Xilio will give his presentation. This webinar will be recorded, so we'll make sure you receive this recording either today or tomorrow. If you have any questions during today's webinar, please use the chat box, the chat function, and we'll try to answer your questions as soon as possible. For now, I would like to hand it over to Antonio for this little introduction of himself. Antonio, you're ready to go?
Thank you, Purdy. Yes.
Welcome.
Yes, great to be here with you both. So for the audience, my name's Antonio Mayo. I'm 9-time Microsoft MVP in originally SharePoint and then Office 365 and now Office Apps and Services. I've worked with the Microsoft platforms for a very long time. I'm also a director and senior enterprise architect with Protiviti. And Sjoerd, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, Antonio. My name is Sjoerd Alkema. I'm responsible for content services within Xilio, Director of Content Services. I have a background in document management and enterprise content management. Actually, have been implementing the systems we're going to talk about. So excited to do so. With this, I think without our moderator, we'll just get started with what we would want to share. And I think, Antonio, it would be good if you start the show.
Absolutely. Thank you. So we wanted to talk today a little bit about traditional document management systems, how those are evolving and changing, perhaps what drove those systems, and more importantly, I think how Project Cortex is impacting those traditional document management systems and how we manage content, how we manage our documents. So I'm going to share my screen, and Purdy, I'll ask if you can just confirm that you can see it.
Not yet, but yes, I can, and now our audience can see it as well.
Great, thank you. So again, we're going to talk about traditional document management systems, how we traditionally have managed our documents, and how Project Cortex is impacting that. I'm going to go through some of this, and I have a bit of a demonstration as well, and then Sjoerd, I'll hand it over to you, and you can share your thoughts on similar topics. So when we think about our traditional document management systems in the past, from my experience, I've found that they've been traditionally driven by storage requirements or policies that our organizations needed to implement for retaining data. Now, these were typically large, complex applications. They were usually hosted in on-premise environments, or they were vast network file shares. In many organizations that I've worked with, I've actually seen both in place, where you have large network file shares with millions, tens of millions of documents, and then a complex document management system as well that's designed to store your documents that you need to retain, documents that need to be kept for policies, and often the data that was designated as a record or a record of business value was moved off to these other applications. So what we were doing is we were moving our records off to another system. And these systems were managed as silos. They were typically secured with network boundaries, perhaps folder permissions, and they often had complex metadata structures for allowing users to classify documents as records or as certain types of records. And what I'm driving towards here is how these systems were put in place often to help us comply with the regulations that were important to our organizations.
Antonio, just to break your word there. Yes, it's chaos actually. I had to swap tenants repeatedly and then go back into my old tenant, come into the Zilio tenant, and then go all the way back in, just so that I could get the presenter view to come up. So apologies for being tardy on trying to get in. It was, Purdy was right in saying that it was technical difficulties, and she did do the introduction and stole all my thunder around welcoming everyone to all you need to know about Project Cortex, brought to you by Zilio. I've been practicing that for a few days now. My name's Alice
you do that
Pujan,
much better than I do.
and I will be your captain for this voyage into the content services abyss, right? I mean, that's where we were supposed to get to. And please note, if you have any questions, stick it in the Q&A, and we'll try and get Antonio and Stuart to answer that for you. Yes, and we did blame it on technical difficulties. We'll also be providing attendees a webinar recap covering all the take-home points from this session. And then I'd welcome everyone and say welcome to Antonio. Stuart's always here, so we don't generally welcome him. And then it was really to have a conversation, to talk to exactly what Antonio's taken everyone through. What does traditional document management systems mean to you, Antonio? I think that's the angle that you were leaning towards. And what is a DMS? What are the regulatory compliance? So I'm just going to hand straight back to you, and then I'll just step in as we go through the conversational topics that we are raising today.
Sure. So I much prefer to do this as a conversation, as you're saying, Alistair. So let's kind of shift this to that. So very much the document management systems that I've seen in the past, where we've thought of traditional document management systems. Sometimes we've called them enterprise content management systems as well. Traditionally, they're these applications, these kind of siloed applications, which is where we put our content. And we found that generally they were developed to meet particular regulations or policy requirements, right? I've listed a few of them here that we work with our customers every day. You'll recognize many of the acronyms here. And it's very important. It's critical, in fact, to meet those policy requirements, but typically that led to systems that were difficult to use, that had low adoption, that required you to classify your documents manually, and usually there was a complex information architecture or metadata structure that you had to utilize to classify your documents, and there was little flexibility around that, right? So ultimately you had these systems that perhaps a handful of people in the organization really understood the information architecture for, and that led to some adoption, but certainly not mass adoption of the platform. They often lacked modern capabilities like we enjoy today, like mobility, for example.
Yeah, funnily enough, I was chatting to Microsoft's Global Black Belts earlier on today about what ECM is, right? It was a big, and what knowledge management is, and the difference between tacit and codified knowledge, and how to bring together this knowledge economy. And you touched on something earlier on, specifically around metadata management. Is it a thing in the new world? I mean, you spent a lot of time in your career looking at the regulatory and the compliance and the statutory regulations associated with building out huge content repositories with masses of metadata. Is there a change in the way the world is looking at metadata management today versus working with some of the other legacy enterprise content management systems of yesteryear?
So very much so. Over the last, so in my work, as you've alluded to, I work very much with organizations on helping them secure their environments and helping them build infrastructure and policies and configurations that help them to comply with the regulations that are important to them. And I often work with record managers in that. And in the last couple of years, I have been amazed to hear record managers tell me users don't fill out metadata, right? There's no point in us putting all of these metadata columns because users just don't want to provide it. They don't want to do it. They don't understand the metadata structure. They have a hard time choosing. They just pick the defaults. And we can't really rely on these information architectures that we've traditionally developed. It is still a thing in that we still need people to classify documents, and you can look at classification in two different ways, right? You can look at it from the perspective of classifying documents for sensitivity from a security perspective, You can also using it as classifying it for retention in order to meet particular regulations around how data is retained and disposed and so on. So it is still very much a thing, but I have heard record managers tell me this repeatedly over the last couple of years. So I think that nature of building out an information architecture is evolving. We're seeing much more, I'll say, propensity or desire to find simpler ways to apply that metadata to content.
It makes complete sense, right? Where in the old days you'd hire a librarian to classify and categorize your content, right? And then they eventually became records managers or records officers, and they'd still work on the standard that we had 10 years ago, the Dublin Core, right? I mean, that was a standard across multiple enterprise content management platforms, and that was really what people subscribed to. And then you started working with, let's say, a petrochemical oil and gas company, and you'd spend 3 months talking to them about how to create content types with rich metadata. And 6 months into your journey, you'd come back and they'd be using 2 content types, one called long and one called short, right? And that's what they'd work with because users are lazy. There's no need for them to classify and categorize content because if you give them 13 metadata fields and 12 of them are required, they're just not going to upload content. And that's why we coined the phrase shadow IT, because they'd rather put it in Dropbox than have to fill in 13 columns to upload a document to a content repository like SharePoint.
Absolutely, and the problem I highlighted in that first bullet gets exacerbated even more, where not only do you have these complex applications and network file shares, then you have the content repository in the cloud that the person happened to choose. Dropbox is a good example.
And for me, it's you end up struggling with, so which version is the latest version of the truth, because someone's got it on their desktop, or it's in a file share, or it's in a content repository like SharePoint. So how do we get to a state where we managing this duplication of data more efficiently, and how do we do a decent sort of mapping when it comes to how we manage that content? Because I've got 5 versions and I don't know which one is the latest version.
Yeah. So that's a great question, and it's a good transition kind of to the next slide. So I'm gonna turn this into a combination of conversation and going through the presentation that I had. But we've seen a real shift in this notion of storing content in an enterprise content management system or in a document management system to move that content to cloud-based content services, we like to call it, where content services refers to a collection of services that not only helps you manage your documents, but also helps you perform modern collaboration on that content. Things like co-authoring, working on documents not only on a laptop or a desktop computer, but also on a mobile device, and really making it easy to use and easy to share that content. Right, all of this drives us towards connecting people to content more easily, and especially in the current situation of the world, enabling remote work more easily. So this move to content services, I think, has facilitated a change in this approach, where the most important thing is not only managing content to meet regulations and requirements, but also to enable collaboration and enable people to get more out of the platform. So, as we work through these systems, as we look to adopt these cloud-based content services, it does drive us to bring all of our organizational content into one platform. And what we're talking about here, of course, is the Microsoft 365 platform. Right, if you look at the traditional document management systems, they tended to focus mostly on documents, perhaps emails that you saved as a file, and scanned files. But now with this cloud-based content services platform, you can also incorporate conversations and chat, forums, recordings, images, all of that content that we work on day to day. You've got, of course, the benefits of security that come with the platform. So M365 uses a zero trust security model, depending on how you configure it for your organization, where you secure your identities, your devices, your apps, and your data, and that's built in. It's not a bolt-on tool, and it comes with some great advanced threat protection services that are provided as part of that native platform.
Something that you mentioned further up about bringing all organizational content into one platform from a content services perspective. When you look at Project Cortex and the Graph API and where Microsoft is going with that, I think they actually have 130 connectors, both first party as well as third party. So the content doesn't necessarily have to be migrated. You can surface that as well. And I know that Zillio's got a few connectors of their own that'll allow you to, and why I'm mentioning it is a migration doesn't take a day and a half.
Yeah.
You know, that's usually stage gated where you go from department to department and you still need access to that legacy ECM system, or if it's a file share, you want to tap into the richness of content services while still having content sitting in that original content repository. And funnily enough, today on the call with the GBBs, we were talking about how to surface content through a connector so that you can actually have the organization work not only in a hybrid mode, but also use the new front end so that you can get the richness of content services immediately. You don't have to wait. I think that's probably the messaging for me is how we do bring in content that's sitting in a repository that hasn't been migrated yet.
You're absolutely right. That bringing all your organizational content into one platform does not necessarily require a migration. The graph connectors that you're alluding to allow you to connect to your on-premise content repositories, other cloud content repositories, where that content can be indexed, it can be searched and managed along with your M365 content, all through one platform. So although those files might be sitting off in a network file share still, you can surface them through M365 and have it benefit from some of these same automation capabilities.
Sure. Just a comment from you on surfacing content. I know you've been working with what Simon likes to call complex migrations. But I mean, you guys do the pre-staging, and then from pre-staging, you run the enterprise load and transform content. Are you seeing quite a big push for content to be made available even though it's not in the systems of record currently, or it's in a system of record and it needs to move into a system or a content repository like SharePoint Online?
Yeah, we do. We see actually both the developments that you're just referring to. So one is the migration. We see that with Cortex. Anyway, there's been a wave going on, but with Cortex, organizations have an easier choice to move through from their legacy ECM or traditional document management system into Microsoft 365. So definitely we see this more and more, but also the integration, right? So not migrating, still having the repository as it was, but using it in Cortex to provide your users the knowledge that they seek on that moment in time in that process. So it's definitely a combination, and we're actually in both solutions, working on both solutions.
Okay, coming back to you, Antonia, around content recognition and identification, and you were talking about a zero trust security model being built in. Are there fears around content security when it comes to the regulations that you've listed there around data privacy, records management standards, and a few other around the HIPAA and the PHI stuff?
Very much so. So all of those regulations that I've listed there have aspects to them that relate to how information is secured. And what we have found is that the zero trust security model, so adopting that approach to securing your systems, your environment, your content, very much leads towards a much more holistically secured environment where you have to have an identity to access particular systems and content. Your device has to be a managed device. The application has to be managed and approved as well as you go through conditional access policies that examine what application are you using to access this content, and your data is secured as well. So personally, I find this is a much more holistic approach to securing both the environment and the data right? Because you're securing it at all levels, right? From the network level to the application level to the device that you're using to access it, and the individual data items as well.
Look, from my side, when I start looking at content classification, because it's a big conversation, specifically when it comes to tooling like Project Cortex that sits on top of SharePoint. And you were talking about content identification and zero trust. What about organizations out there that don't know what content they have? We've seen in the past that Microsoft's got the AIP, the Azure Information Protection Scanner, and generally you can deploy that to your on-premises file server, and with that you are able to sniff through content and identify what is highly confidential, what's not confidential, what's public, what's private, what is very sensitive, and apply the necessary rules to that. With Project Cortex, there's some similarities around content processing. So if I had 500,000 documents that's never been classified, it's been stuck into multiple folders, and I've got folder permissions there. From my understanding, and I need your input here because you've worked with the product more than I have, content processing in today's world is a little bit different than scanning a piece of paper and doing form type recognition, because Microsoft's got quite a bit of artificial intelligence and machine learning built in there. From your experiences with Project Cortex, are they making it easier for you to take 500,000 documents that you haven't classified and pulled it into a repository and then do intelligent content processing on top of that?
Absolutely. So I think I'm going to go through the rest of my presentation because I think this is a good lead into that. The question is absolutely yes. Like you mentioned AIP scanner there a moment ago, and that's a great tool for scanning on-premise file shares and on-premise SharePoint environments. But I would say from my experience with it, it is focused on finding sensitive data types within documents, right? It's focused very much on regular expressions like credit card numbers and identity numbers and keywords, and using that to trigger this is a sensitive piece of data. But you know, when you think of documents like contracts and purchase orders, invoices, they may not have those types of recognizable patterns within them. So I think this higher level notion of using the nature of a document and you know, the content within it to implement a more intelligent way of classifying your documents. That's where this industry is going, and that's where Project Cortex is leading us. You know, when I want to focus here for a moment on compliance with those regulations, that is still critical for organizations, right? I mentioned a moment ago, these content services platforms, especially M365, is helping us balance collaboration with complying with our regulations, but it's still critical that we meet those regulations. And I do find that approaching this entire industry from the perspective of content services and Project Cortex is really driving us towards a method to automate the way that we achieve compliance with those regulations. Right? If we look at Project Cortex, Microsoft positions it as building your knowledge network for your organization. But I think you have to look at it also from the perspective of M365 is great at connecting people with content, but Project Cortex is enabling us to connect people with knowledge. So you mentioned tacit knowledge a moment ago. So, you know, knowledge related to a document I happen to have on my desktop or in my OneDrive that's not shared widely, but that other people may need, that type of tacit knowledge, or the knowledge that we can gain from, I don't know, 100,000 invoices or purchase orders that we process a week. It's hard to extract knowledge from that much content, but that is what Project Cortex is enabling us to do with its automated content processing capabilities. And then that leads us to be able to automate the security and compliance of our content, right? Content services, I think, is an underlying concept across all of this. So as we work with content within this M365 platform, whether it's in Teams or SharePoint or OneDrive or in our email or other services, they all benefit from these capabilities that Project Cortex is providing to extract knowledge from that data and then unify it and present it back to users, so that if there are topics that you need to know to do your job, you can easily get at information about those topics. Or if I have large amounts of transactional content, like contracts, like invoices, like purchase orders, I can more easily and in an automated way extract information from those. Right. The great example that we like to use is Project Cortex can easily tell you that this document is a contract, but it can also tell you what the value of that contract is, who the contract is with, when it becomes effective and when it expires, and be able to extract that in an automated way allows us to kick off these automated processes for compliance and security. So there are a number of content processing capabilities provided with Cortex that allow us to automate that classification process. What traditionally we would have required a user to do with a complex information architecture or large numbers of metadata fields that only a handful of people in the organization understood, we can now automate that process. There are 2 different content processing capabilities that have been released with Cortex. So Project Cortex, we look at that as an initiative within Microsoft that is going to release multiple products. The first product that has been released is SharePoint Syntex, and that has 2 content processing capabilities. One is around form processing, and that uses AI Builder to process documents that look like forms, feel like forms, or structured like forms. And document understanding, so perhaps a little more unstructured content, that as you work with this content in Microsoft 365, as you upload this content or create this content, it can automatically extract topics and entities and words from those documents and then automatically populate that metadata. So you can see here in the screenshot, there's a number of metadata fields within that library, things like an amount, a price, a total, settlement, who the customer is. As I add documents to this library, Project Cortex can automatically extract those entities from the documents based on machine learning models that I have previously trained or taught. And then when we extend that to compliance, we know that in M365, there's some great robust capabilities for applying retention labels to manage a file plan, a real file plan, to manage real disposition according to whatever policies are important to us. We can also apply sensitivity labels to content that both identify what content is sensitive and can protect that content as well through encryption and rights management. So both of those capabilities, applying retention labels and applying sensitivity labels, can be automatically applied with policies in M365, and we can base those automated policies on that metadata that Project Cortex extracts. So as Project Cortex runs on documents, runs within libraries as I create new documents or upload documents, it can extract that metadata. It can apply a content type to those documents. Based on that content type, it can automatically apply a retention label. It can apply sensitivity labels, and I can have more complex policies that look at a combination of those metadata fields to figure out what's the right retention label for this document, or what's the right sensitivity label for this document. So I'll pause there, Alistair. Any questions?
Great. Yes. So we've spoken about data capture, right? I mean, if we have to sort of dumb it down, you mentioned 100,000 invoices coming in, and using content processing engine and a little bit of AI building on the back end, we can do indexing and classification of documents based on metadata inside of the document. And I think that is, for me, the core strength here is the content processing. And coupled that with identification classification based on specific metadata. So if it has a social security number, not that an invoice would have that, but let's say you were processing documents that had sensitive information types that you have created, a custom sensitive information type around an invoice number which you don't want to get out, or something like that. We talked about the classification, and then we also talked about how this content gets stored with that slide that you had, the last slide around information protection and labeling from a data loss prevention perspective, as well as being able to make sure that some form of records management is applied to it, because we know that there's a retention and a disposition schedule associated, well, a retention schedule and a disposition process associated with that piece of content that we need to do things with. So around analytics and file plans that you can associate with this content. Can you talk to us a bit about, well, I know where my content is. I've brought it in. I've identified the content now. I know what it is, you know, where it is, what it is. How do I go about retrieving this content? And you also talked about I might have content sitting on my desktop when you refer to stuff like tacit knowledge. And how do we surface that using Project Cortex in this new knowledge economy that we've now built inside of Microsoft 365?
So I think there's two key ways that you surface it. One, and you alluded to this earlier, Alistair, is through Microsoft Search and the graph connectors that are available for Microsoft Search, where I can have it index content, you know, both within M365, repositories outside of M365, but it will also search content on my desktop and even on the internet, depending on how you configure it. So I think one way that you surface it is through Microsoft Search, enabling you to have a more robust information architecture and classification that's been automatically applied by Project Cortex. Then when I use Microsoft Search to search, whether it's on my desktop, in a web browser, in SharePoint or Outlook, in Word, Excel, or PowerPoint, I can get at that content. I can find it easier. So that's one way. And then the second way is, and you can see this on the Project Cortex website, the Microsoft website, is there's going to be an ability to actually highlight topics across the different workloads that you work within. So if you're working in Teams, or you're working on a SharePoint site, or you're working in Outlook or in a document, topics that have been identified by Cortex and curated by a person within your organization, someone that we might refer to as a knowledge manager, who decides what topics to expose and where do those topics take you to learn more. Those topics are going to get highlighted across these different workloads. And as you hover over them, it's going to bring up a topic card that tells you more about what that topic means. And then clicking on that will take you off to a knowledge center, which is a curated collection of knowledge for your organization. And I mentioned curated because you can think of it as knowledge goes through a life cycle where, you know, knowledge comes into an organization, it's important, it might start to sunset at some point years later, it might need to be deprecated later when it's no longer relevant or important to the organization.
So that's the new world that we're hoping to occupy space in. Stuart, you were talking earlier on about old ECM systems or legacy ECM systems and how they relate to this new model, because we can't. Would you like to share that with the audience?
Yeah. So let me share my screen as well. So you're gonna like this, Alistair, I know. Because I pulled up this poster, if you can see my screen. So
yeah,
a bit of
I can see it.
ECM.
Yeah.
And so this is how we looked at ECM, right? So to understand why now these older traditional document management solutions can be moved into SharePoint with Cortex easier, you need to understand where it came from. So it was really about the following drivers, I think, most of the time. Regulatory compliance. Well, Antonio talked about that. That was a main driver, but also efficiency. So better collaboration, even with those large ECM implementations. A focus was to better collaborate, even pre-SharePoint, right? And automation in structured and transactional processes. And that's kind of an important one because with the capture and with the forms processing being developed throughout the time, that was always kind of a differentiator. It's differentiator if you look at the pure collaboration platforms like SharePoint was. And here I see the both worlds come together right now. Other drivers were, of course, cost savings and business continuity and preservation. Also more and more being part of that Microsoft platform right now. And to continue with old pictures, we all know this. And to visualize now and then, so back then Microsoft was here, right? It was really the collaboration side of things, and that's basically all that they cared about: email management, document management. They're moving towards the capture side, the preservation side, and taking more and more of this roadmap with it. So I know the old ECM guys will know this. Actually, when I was at my first job, this was on the wall where with our information management practice, everybody had to learn this by heart.
I used the other one. There's quite a the ECM one. The ECM 101 poster. I actually used it in my presentation today.
Oh, really?
And it's got the same words, right? It talks about capture, store, deliver, manage,
yes.
and preserve.
Yeah.
It's got more color to it than that, but that's the second version of that ECM 101 poster.
Yeah, funny. And then, so this also has the BPM component, right? And this is where I think, so if we look at business process management, really the hardcore BPM, we'll have to see how that goes. But I think there's a slight gap still if you look at the old platforms. So to conclude, what we see from Xilium, from myself, as the impact of now Microsoft Cortex on traditional ECM. It's really that right now, what we know right now of Cortex, right? It's syntax, and we know it's coming, but not all yet. So right now, our customers are having less trouble in seeing how they could move to Microsoft 365 from their legacy ECM. And basically the reasons are processes with intelligent capture that are always, or most of the times, a big part of those ECM implementations. They can now be part of their solution in Microsoft 365. So the choice that were anyway being made, right? So there's a lot of movement going on, but it's easier. The support for transactional structured document processes. So syntax with the capture that Antonio and the intelligent capture that Antonio just showed, and the intelligent classification. That really makes it easier to also hand over those processes to Microsoft 365 in the cloud. I've always been working in case management solutions, case management processes, and I see that now is also possible. So that's also a big driver for many organizations. Near future, what we see, we will still be migrating away from legacy, even more probably, but also, and we touched on this already, integration will be important. We're actually currently working with a number of customers on Cortex projects. One of them you just mentioned, ModMcDonald, but there are a few other ones that we're working, and it's really all about integration as well. Still consolidate where you can, but integrating other repositories as well, and their knowledge management will come together with other content processes and collaboration, right? So that's really the future we see, an integrated knowledge and information processing environment where, as a user, you're brought what you need at the right time.
So Antonio, just to close out the last things around this, so what does this actually mean to the current industry, to the organizations out there that do have these content repositories, and they are either looking to move or they want to surface content inside of tooling like Cortex and Syntex?
So I think organizations are just starting right now to kind of digest the capabilities that have been released, right? We only had SharePoint Syntex get released, a couple of weeks ago, well, a few weeks ago now, on October 1st. So I think people are just starting to understand the capabilities and the opportunities that it presents. I think that organizations, many that we're working with, and Shord that you alluded to, are in the process of moving content into M365. There is benefit to having it all in one place if you can. Certainly one of those benefits is consistency in how it's managed, but integrating other repositories where you can, right? I think, Shord, you said it well, consolidating where you can, integrating others. I think that's an important strategy for how you bring all this content together. And you know, I think we're going to see that kind of move accelerate, Project Cortex is going to reveal to people the benefits of machine learning and the automation that it can provide. So I think we'll start to see more and more interest in that space.
Last couple of things. How do people get hold of you, Antonio, if they need to reach out to you or they've got questions and all of those things?
That's a great question. So a couple ways. So certainly my email address is I do still use email, despite people moving and even myself moving a lot of my work to Microsoft Teams. I'm still on email, of course. Antonio.mayo@protiviti.com. And Twitter as well. On Twitter, I am, for good or bad, I'm Antonio Mayo 2. There was already an Antonio Mayo who's a motorcycle racer in Italy and is living a life that I wish I had.
That you live through vicariously. Well, thanks everyone for attending today's webinar. If you'd like to know more about making legacy ECM migrations easier or easy, please feel free to reach out to Zilio on LinkedIn or drop them an email drop your email in the chat, and someone will reach out to you and contact you directly, or just find me on Twitter. I'm at Alistair Pugin. And Stuart, are you spending your days on Twitter?
I'm not spending my days, to be honest, but quite a few hours a day, I think. Yeah.
So thanks.
It's my name. Yeah. Cool.
So that's Stuart. That's SJOERD. Yeah. So you can find any one of us on Twitter. Thanks a lot for joining us today, and we hope to see you next time when we talk to more industry experts about all you need to know about Project Cortex. Cheers, bye.